Hi everybody, this is Marlene with Eerie News, and today is January 20th, 2025, Monday, January 20th, 2025, and let's get off to a good old-fashioned true crime slash cold case. My favorite is out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories and is titled The Hitchhiker Murders. On February 4th, 1972, the first two victims of what became known as the Hitchhiker Murders disappeared. Their names were Maureen Sterling and Yvonne Weber. They were both 12 years old and attended Herbert Slater Middle School. They were last seen around 9 p.m. at the Redwood Empire Ice Arena. By 1973, a total of 7 unsolved murders took place in the North Bay area of California. They involved female hitchhikers that were found nude and dumped in rural areas, where it is believed they were thrown from the road. The girls had been hitchhiking on Guerneville Road, and only skeletal remains were recovered 10 months later down a steep embankment. The cause of death could not be determined. The girls were nude and were each only wearing one earring, later on establishing a belief that the killer was keeping jewelry as trophies or souvenirs of his killings. A month to the day of Yvonne and Maureen's disappearance, Kim Allen, aged 19, was seen hitchhiking near the entrance to Highway 101. Unlike the first two victims, Kim was found the following day in a creek bed off Enterprise Road in Santa Rosa. She had been raped and semen was recovered from the body. A single gold loop earring was found at the site. She had superficial cuts on her chest and rope burns on her wrists and ankles, where she had been hogtied, forcing her to strangle to death slowly over the span of 30 minutes. There was no doubt that she was killed at the hands of a sexual sadist. Markings at the top of the embankment indicated the perpetrator likely fell or slipped while throwing the body down into the creek bed. 2 men who had given her a ride earlier that day were ruled out as suspects after passing a polygraph test. On November 11, 1972, Lori Cursa was shopping at the U-Save with her mother. She was only 13 years old, however it seems she had run away deliberately. She was seen on November 20th or 21st in Santa Rosa, where she was visiting friends, probably after hitching a ride, which she was known to do. On December 14th, 1972, barely a month after she was seen at the U-Save, in a ravine northeast of Rincon Valley, her frozen remains were found. She had not been raped, and it was estimated she had died about 2 weeks prior to her body being found. The cause of death was a broken neck and hemorrhage of the spinal cord. Authorities believe she was kidnapped, stripped of her clothing, and as she opened the passenger door of the speeding vehicle in an attempt to escape her captor or captors, she fell, jumped, or was pushed out and broke her neck in the 30-foot fall into the ravine. She was left by the side of the road. The broken neck would have prevented Cursa from moving, but it would have taken some time for her to die. What did you think about it? Was pretty cool. Well, there were killers, but makes you wonder, did they think she was dead or did they just not care? She still had wire loops in her earlobes, but her earrings had been removed. Later, a witness came forward to say that sometime at the beginning of December, he had seen a girl fitting Cursa's description being forced into the back of a van. The driver was a Caucasian man with an afro hairstyle. Carolyn Davis, age 14, was a runaway who also made a habit of hitchhiking. She left her home on February 1973. In 2022, her sister was interviewed and she said that Carolyn had stayed with her after she ran away. Davis claimed she had witnessed a double murder in Shasta County and that she was afraid for her life. Despite only being 14 years old, she hitchhiked to Illinois and returned 4 months later. She was last seen by her grandmother, who dropped her off on July 15, 1973, outside the Garberville post office. She was seen hitchhiking near the southbound ramp of Highway 101. She said she was returning to her boyfriend in Illinois, but was stopping first to see friends in Modesto, California. Caroline's body was discovered on July 31st, just 4 feet from where the bodies of Sterling and Weber had been found in December 1972. Initially, she was unidentified, and her sister, who read about the body being found, forwarded her dental records to the police, who made the match. An investigator on the case said a witchcraft symbol meaning carrier of spirits was found by Carolyn's body. It was described as a rectangle connected to a square with bars running alongside, made of sticks or twigs. The symbol is supposed to date back to medieval England and suggested a tie to the Zodiac killer. The symbol was found on the roadway above where her body was found. After Davis's murder, her sister worked as a hotel maid at the California Motel in Anderson. There she found a map in a room that she knew belonged to her sister and had been in her possession when she left Garberville. It had Davis's handwriting on it, and her sister turned it over to police. She was killed with strychnine poison about 2 weeks before being found. It could not be established if she had been raped, and like the other victims, it appeared she had been thrown down a hillside right off the road. Besides the strychnine, she had no other drugs in her system. Teresa Smith Walsh, age 23, missing only 3 days before Christmas 1973. She was hitchhiking to Garberville to see her family for the holidays, often thumbing a ride on Highway 101. Separated from her husband, she had left her 2-year-old son with her mother, Goldie Smith. Within a week, her body was found by kayakers in Mark West Creek, where she was partially submerged under a log. This was only less than 100 yards from where Lori Cursa was found. She had been raped, and with clothesline rope, her thumbs had been bound together, then her wrists, who were then tied to her thighs. Her ankles had also been tied up, and a length of rope had been tied to the ankle bindings, run up her back, looped about her neck, and pulled snug with her heels against her buttocks. The pain of being cinched up must have been excruciating. However, stretching her legs to relieve the strain tightened the noose around her throat. As she inevitably tired and relaxed her legs, she slowly and agonizingly throttled herself to death. The same M.O. was found in several of the victims. It was estimated she had been dead about a week by the time she was found. Not all the victims were found right away. On July 2nd, 1979, skeletal remains were found in a ravine of Calistoga Road, about 100 yards from where the body of Lori Cursa was found in 1972. Unlike Lori, but like other victims dumped elsewhere, she had been hogtied, and one of her arms had been broken. Lengths of cord used in Venetian blinds were found around one ankle bone, and then around the neck bones where it had been wound a few times. Her body was stuffed into a duffel bag. It was estimated she was a teenager or in her early 20s, and was killed between 1972 and 1979. She wore contact lenses and had dark red or brown hair, and was about 5 feet tall. She has never been identified. Initially, it was thought she was Jeanette Kamehale, but comparison of dental records confirmed she was not. I read further on this, and it seems she was killed during the early 70s because she had hard contact lenses that were in use during the early 70s, like 72, 73. In other words, around that group of killings, those initial killings, 72, 73, so forth. So anyway, let's keep going. Now, these are all possible victims. Jeanette Kamehale was last seen on April 25, 1972, hitchhiking on the ramp to Highway 101. She was a student at Santa Rosa Junior College, and after that date, she's never been seen, dead or alive. A friend saw her get into a brown Chevy pickup truck outfitted with a homemade wooden camper and driven by a white young male with an afro hairstyle. When the Jane Doe was found in July 1979, a comparison of dental records confirmed it was not Jeanette. Her parents are now deceased, but she had a brother who was still hoping to find out what happened to his sister. Carrie Graham and Francine Trimble were next-door neighbors and good friends. They disappeared in mid-December 1978. A friend said they had planned to hitchhike in order to attend a party in Santa Rosa. 7 months later, unidentified skeletal remains were found in Mendocino County, about 100 miles northwest of where they were last seen. The victims were nude, and both had been bound with duct tapes. The remains were stuffed inside plastic bags, but since they were buried in shallow graves, animals had scavenged the bodies. Police believed they had been murdered elsewhere and then dumped in the rural area. Even though 90% of the skeletal remains were recovered, forensic evidence initially determined that one victim was male, the other female, and that they were siblings, which could account why the remains were not identified for so many years. In 2000, they were exhumed from a cement crypt at the Russian River Cemetery in Ukiah, California. but then there was some doubt as to the theory they were siblings and that one was male. It was not until 2014, and when a second exhumation was performed, that a better idea was formed as to their likeness and that they were both female. In 2015, with the help of DNA evidence, their identity was confirmed. Francine Trimble's parents were deceased, and Carrie Graham's were still alive and able to find out what happened to their daughter 36 years after her disappearance. Their murder remains unsolved. There is a theory that Francine and Carrie were the victims of serial killers Gerard and Charlene Gallego, who were active from 1978 to 1980, and if so, they would be victims number 5 and 6. These killers were most active in Sacramento and murdered at least 11 victims, often keeping them as sex slaves. In February 1975, the FBI issued a report where they indicated that 14 murders committed between 1972 and 1974 were the handiwork of the same perpetrator. These were in addition to the 6 that had already been discovered by 1975. So we're talking here a total of 20. They found connections between the disposal of the bodies and the belief that the killer took souvenirs from his victims. The killer had shifted his hunting ground to the San Francisco area. On May 29, 1973, Rosa Vasquez, 20, was discovered dead at the entrance to the Golden Gate Park. She had been strangled and her nude body thrown from a nearby road to land under some bushes. She was employed at the Letterman General Hospital on the Presidio as a key punch operator. 2 weeks later, on June 10th, Yvonne Quilatang, 15, was found strangled in a vacant lot in the Bayview district. She was 7 months pregnant. Less than a month later, on July 2nd, 1973, Angela Thomas, 16, was found nude on the playground of Benjamin Franklin Junior High School. She had been smothered to death and a locket was recovered near her body. She was originally from Belton, Texas, and had only been in the area 3 weeks where she was visiting friends. This new killing ground proved to be fertile for this serial killer. On July 12th, Nancy Gidley, 24, was staying at a roadway inn where it was believed she was abducted from. Her nude, strangled body was found behind the George Washington High School gymnasium. She had only one fish-shaped gold earring hanging from her ear. Originally from Idaho, she had served 4 years in the Air Force. She told her family she was going to San Francisco to attend a friend's wedding as a maid of honor, and to write for the San Francisco Chronicle, both stories which later on turned out to be false. These murders coincided with the murder of a young woman thumbing a ride off Highway 101. It seemed this killer had not totally abandoned the allure of picking up hitchhikers. On July 22, 1973, the partially clad body of 23-year-old Nancy Fusey was found by a fisherman in a remote area of Redding. She had been stabbed 29 times in the chest, stomach, and arms. She was a mother of 5 and had been separated from her husband for 7 months. The sheriff believed she had been killed elsewhere and then dumped in the area she had been found in. Laboratory tests revealed she had sexual intercourse within 24 hours of her death, but the sheriff did not believe that figured in her murder. She was last seen by her roommate when she left for a party. The police determined she attended a dance in Plumbers Hall, across from the California State University, then left at 2 a.m. It's believed she might have hitchhiked a ride to North Highlands. This was 3 hours before her body was found by a fisherman. Her case remains unsolved. Nancy Fusey's children were left in the care of their father, Gerald Marshall Fusey, who was abusive, often withholding food from the children as a form of punishment, and his daughter Angela ran away from home when she was 16 with a carnival worker. Throughout the years, she became involved in criminal activity and drugs, and her children were placed in foster care. After being released from jail, her daughter was returned to her, but 2 sons told the judge they preferred to stay in the foster care system instead of returning to the care of their abusive mother. In 2011, Angela Darlene Fusey McNulty was convicted of torturing, beating, and starving to death her 15-year-old daughter, Jeanette Marie Maples. McNulty became the 2nd woman ever sentenced to die in Oregon, and the first since the 1984 reinstatement of the death penalty. Also charged were Richard McNulty, her husband, who was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. In 2019, Judge J. Burdett Pratt ruled that Angela McNulty should get a new trial because her attorneys failed to adequately represent her during her trial. In 2020, she was sentenced to life behind bars without the possibility of parole. The death of all these victims had a ripple effect among their families, not only causing heartbreak but creating human tragedy beyond the point of their murder. On November 4th, 1973, the body of Laura Odell, 21, was found in some bushes behind a boathouse at Stowe Lake and Golden Gate Bridge. She was nude and her hands were tied behind her back. It appeared the cause of death was strangulation or head injuries. She had also been raped. She had been missing for 2 days. According to police, the same man murdered Brenda Merchant at Marysville by stabbing her to death on February 1st, 1974. She was found in the living room of her apartment, clad only in a nightgown. She had been stabbed more than 30 times and drowned in a pool of her own blood. Her infant son slept undisturbed in his room. And the only clue the police had was a bloody handprint left on the screen door of the apartment. The last victim was 14-year-old Donna Brown, who was found nude and strangled floating in the Salinas River near Monterey. Her nude body was discovered by a crop-dusting pilot who was flying overhead. Several theories and killers have been proposed throughout the years. There was an occult theory because of the phase of the moon they were killed on, or that they were dumped on the east side of the highway and that the killer was familiar with the occult. The Zodiac Killer and Ted Bundy were considered as the killers. One person who's been looked at as the killer and who did have a direct link to one of the victims was Frederick "Fred" Manali, age 41. He was an Army veteran and he worked as a creative writing instructor at Santa Rosa Junior College and San Quentin Prison. He was killed in a head-on collision when his van veered onto oncoming traffic on Highway 12 west of Santa Rosa in August 1976. In those queer twists of fate that sometimes explains why certain killers disappear from the murder map, if he indeed was the murderer, was the way he died, and which provided the clue of his secret life as a sadomasochistic pervert. By the way, later on, they're not sure if it was an accident, as in accidental, or if he really did commit suicide by going into oncoming traffic on purpose. But he took that secret to the grave with him. Let's keep going. Sources say that after the accident, the sheriff found drawings in the back of the van of women in sadomasochistic positions, listing them according to their sexual preference. One of them was Kim Wendy Allen, who was found dead in 1972. Two other students were also depicted in these drawings. Fred also drew himself as well in drag and captioned himself as Frida Manali. He kept a lock of hair in his wallet, but it did not match Kim Allen's. A backpack was also found, which was connected to one of the victims. His former wife Suzanne supposedly have found other drawings where he was depicted as Frida and other young women in bondage situations. Makes you wonder, why did they get divorced, huh? Let's keep going. Manali lived in the area during the years of the murders. He was in his 30s, making him strong enough to handle abducting his victims and then dumping their bodies. He presented a clean-cut appearance, which made it easy for the girls to trust him. As to why the authorities did not pursue the theory of him being responsible for the murders is still unknown. Perhaps all they had was his reputation as being weird, and sketches of him dressed as a woman. The connection between the S&M flavor of his drawings and the way some of his victims were found is undeniable, though. The problem is that the actual drawings, or even copies of them, have never surfaced, and some claim they were destroyed in 1979. The existence of these drawings were only relayed via someone who used to work at the coroner's office during the time Manali was killed. Will the truth ever be known? We know there was DNA evidence recovered from some of the victims, perhaps when least expected, as in the case of the Golden State Killer who was captured April 2018, and whose real name is Joseph James DeAngelo. The identity of this murderer will be revealed. And let's fast forward a little bit now to more recent times, something known as a North Coast serial killer. There's an ongoing investigation into the suspicious deaths of women along Highway 101. Here we go again, Highway 101. Two women, Alyssa Sade and Amber Dillon, were found dead within a few days of each other in January 2022. The bodies of both women were discovered in remote areas near the highway. The community believes two other women who died in late 2021 are perhaps the victims of a serial killer. The police deny connection between the deaths and that they were victims of a serial killer. The word suspicious has been used by all the police departments investigating these different cases, which is very open to interpretation as being suspicious. Could mean what? On December 8, 2021, Cynthia Crane was found floating in a Mays Canyon Creek. 2 days later, Crystal McCarthy, 33, was discovered 10 days after her disappearance under the 3rd Street Bridge near downtown Napa. All four women were young and attractive and were found dead within 90 miles of each other in the span of a month. Interesting, huh? Now it makes you wonder if this original killer, let's assume it's just one, it might be more than one, he started in the early 70s by grabbing these girls that were hitchhiking. And then maybe the late 70s, hitchhiking had already started getting a bad reputation as far as being very dangerous. So in other words, he was finding less targets hitchhiking. All right? So that's, I think, when he moved maybe into San Francisco and then started going after, he killed one inside her apartment. Like, in other words, these are not your hitchhikers on the side of the road. These were women that were, like just regular people at the park, things like that nature. So yes, considering that there was 20 murders and all of them remain unsolved. Yeah, they have suspicions, but that's not the same thing. Okay, let's go off to another story. This is out of Zero Hedge Zero Hedge News, which is very interesting, and you'll see what I mean because, as everybody knows lately, there's been a lot of weird stories having to do with drones. So this one's titled, Mystery Drones Have Stalked the U.S. for Years. A sudden spike in unidentified drone sightings in the northeastern United States is unnerving residents and lawmakers alike. Similar incidents have occurred for years, however, with little apparent action from the government. Drone sightings reports in California, Maryland, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Utah, and Virginia over the past month have raised questions about the possibility that drones are being used to surveil or attack U.S. infrastructure. The sightings follow several high-profile incidents in recent months, including at U.S. military facilities throughout the country and in the UK and Germany. The White House has downplayed the incidents and denied that there is any evidence of a sustained threat to public safety. Quote, "We have not identified anything anomalous or any national security or public safety risk over the civilian airspace in New Jersey or other states in the Northeast." White House National Security spokesperson John Kirby told reporters on December 16th. Kirby did acknowledge that drones have penetrated restricted airspace, however, including that of the Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, and Picatinny Arsenal Military Research Facility in New Jersey. Although such sightings are currently receiving a lot of media attention, there have been several high-profile drone incidents in the past half-decade for which the federal government has yet to formally account. 5 years ago, for example, a group of large drones began appearing off the coast of California. They stalked and surveilled several Navy and Coast Guard ships, including the technologically advanced guided missile destroyer USS Zumwalt. The incident caused alarm throughout the military and incurred a joint investigation by elements of the U.S. Navy, Coast Guard, and FBI. Members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Commander of the Pacific Fleet were kept apprised of the situation. I never heard about that. That's incredible. No administration nor the Department of Defense has publicly stated what the drones were seeking to accomplish or who was operating them. To investigative reports published by the War Zone in 2021 and 2022, however, revealed that ship logs from one of the Navy vessels involved had identified the source of the drone as the MV Bass Strait, a Hong Kong-flagged bulk carrier. In 2020, a new swarm of large drones began appearing in the skies over rural Colorado and Nebraska, where some of the nation's Minutemen III nuclear missiles are stored. Local officials eventually said no laws were being broken and that drone pilots were not required to file flight plans unless in controlled airspace, such as near an airport. Similarly, the FBI, the Federal Aviation Administration, and local authorities never publicly identified who was operating the drones and suggested most of the sightings were attributable to hobby drones and people misidentifying planets and stars as aircraft. Likewise, Kirby told reporters that many of the 5,000 reports of drone sightings over the past week were attributable to hobbyist commercial drones and people misidentifying stars as aircraft. Oh, come on. Similar incidents have continued apparently unabated. This year alone, and we're talking about this was written in December of 2024. This year alone, drones have approached and entered the restricted airspace over U.S. military installations throughout the country and overseas. Drones were tracked around 3 separate military bases in the UK last month, including Royal Air Force Lakenheath, which serves as the U.S. Air Force's in Europe only fighter wing of the 5th generation F-35 aircraft. Shortly thereafter, federal agents arrested a Chinese national for flying an unregistered drone over Vandenberg Space Force Base in California and taking photos of the SpaceX rocket pads on a day on which the contractor launched a sensitive national reconnaissance payload. Kirby attempted to assuage the fear of potential unidentified drone threat, saying that there were more than 1 million lawfully registered drones in the United States, with thousands of hobbyists and law enforcement officers using the technology. Still, the lack of a federal response to the growing number of drone-related incidents in recent years has left both lawmakers and the public in a state of uncertainty about what is to be done. Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas testified earlier this week that the federal government simply doesn't have enough legal authority to engage drones that are not within restricted airspace, and instead said that local law enforcement should take the lead under federal supervision. In a post on social media platform X, New York Governor Kathy Hochul urged Congress to pass a law that will give us the power to deal directly with the drones. On December 16th, Hochul also announced that the federal government will send the state a state-of-the-art drone detection system after a drone incursion forced the closure of a local airport. I'm grateful for the support, but we need more, she said on X. The drone incursions of recent years have repeatedly come within striking distance of commercial airports and even within close range of the president's aircraft. Federal officials have not identified that drone operators in most of these cases, but maintain there is no immediate or foreign-backed threat. President-elect Donald Trump suggested this week that the Biden administration had intelligence on the source of the drones, but was not revealing it to the public. Kirby rejected the idea. Quote, "There is absolutely no effort to be anything other than as upfront as we can be. If we had information, intelligence, or otherwise that told us that there was a national security threat posed by this drone activity, I would say that." Kirby said the administration has engaged personnel from the Departments of Defense and Homeland Security to help identify and respond to the northeastern U.S. drone sightings. You know what? There's a real thing. We don't want them to ban people from flying drones because I don't agree with that. But let's face it, you're hobbyists, you're regular people. First of all, those drones don't have a long battery life. You're not going to fly them over the airport. You're not going to fly them anywhere, except maybe around your neighborhood if you want, or over land, or if you're taking pictures of something. Nah, it's not a question of banning them. It's a question of the ones that are near military installations. Let's face it, no hobbyist is going to do that. So it's like, this hands off, but we need help. We got to be careful with that. And obviously, there's a reason why it be such a mystery. All right, next story is out of Mysterious Universe, and this is titled "Curious, Unsettling, and Mind-Bending Encounters with Mysterious Humanoid Entities." Boy, I have a little fan that just turned on. And by the way, as you could tell by the background noise, all my animals are up and about and contributing to the ambiance, if you want to call it that, of this cast. But anyway, let's go on with this story from Mysterious Universe. Stories of strange and unnerving humanoid creatures stretch back to the beginning of human civilization, with many of these forming the basis for many myths, legends, and even fairy tales. As the UFO age has unfolded, following the start of the modern UFO era in the mid-1940s, many accounts of encounters with perplexing humanoid entities are also on record, suggesting that whatever these entities are, they are very real and possibly otherworldly. There are also many of these humanoid encounters on record from around the world that several volumes would be required to even come close to documenting them all. Undoubtedly, one of the strangest humanoid encounters on record is also one of the most recent, unfolding in 2019 and featuring a paramedic responding to wildfires in the Amazon who found himself face to face with a 10-foot tall humanoid. The account was placed into the wider public arena through researcher and author Albert Rosales, who has documented many humanoid encounters. According to the account, one evening in September 2019, 30-year-old Paul Parada was working as a volunteer paramedic in the Bolivian region of the Amazon, providing medical assistance to the authorities, and specifically the emergency services, who were tasked with tackling wildfires spreading through much of the Amazon region at the time. On this particular night at around 11 p.m., Parada had stepped outside of his medical tent to smoke a cigarette when he noticed a strange figure seemingly heading in his direction. One of the first things Parada noticed as the figure got closer was how tall he was. As he got closer, he could also see that his skin was pale white and that he was dressed in a shiny one-piece suit that had several silver stripes on it. Furthermore, the strange figure sported long, blonde, shiny hair stretching to at least his upper back. By this time, this tall man was only several feet from where Parada was standing. It was at this point that Parada saw the figure was pressing a towel or small blanket to his upper torso as if he was wounded. Parada called out to him, asking if he needed assistance. The figure responded in perfect Spanish that he did. Perplexed by the whole situation, Parada turned and headed into the medical tent, with the figure following close behind. Once inside the tent, Parada turned to face the figure before asking what the problem was. This time, without speaking, the figure removed the towel, and Parada could see a gaping wound. As soon as he saw the injury, he immediately began treating it. As he did so, he marveled at the fact that despite the amount of blood pouring from the wound, none of it appeared to settle on the figure's clothes, almost as if they were made from some kind of waterproof material. Eventually, he asked the figure how he had come to be injured. The figure answered him. Although much to Parada's shock, he did so telepathically, speaking directly into his mind, telling the paramedic that a puma had attacked him while he was in the forest. The figure appeared to notice a look of shock on the young medic's face as he told him once more using telepathy that he had nothing to fear and that no harm would come to him. Feeling slightly comforted, Parada continued treating the wound. Then an already strange night took an even stranger turn. Following the treatment of the wound, the figure thanked Parada for his help and stood up to leave. Before he left, though, he asked Parada to accompany him outside. As they went to leave, the figure spoke once more, telling the young paramedic that he shouldn't be shocked at what he was about to see. As he followed the tall figure out of the tent, Parada became aware of a large metallic disc-shaped object that hovered several feet away and only a few feet from the ground. As he looked below the craft, he could see two more humanoid figures. They looked almost identical to the figure he had just treated, only these had green skin instead of white. What was strangest of all, however, was the way these other figures moved around almost mechanically or robotically. This is an interesting detail, with many reports of alien encounters featuring details of robot-like creatures. Stranger still, when Parada looked too long at these other figures, he began to sense feelings of fear and dread rising up inside him. After several moments, the two figures began in the direction of the humanoid Parada had just treated. At the same time, the taller, pale-skinned figure began heading towards them. Then he stopped and turned to Parada once more. This time, though, he addressed him by his name, something that shocked him, as Parada hadn't at any point told his figure his name. When the humanoid turned to leave again, Parada took himself back inside the medical tent, his mind racing with the events that had just unfolded. As such, he didn't see the figures into the craft, nor did he see the craft leave. Aside from confiding in his brother, who was also in the region to volunteer his medical skills, Parada would keep the incident largely to himself, at least initially. However, over the next several months, he couldn't cast the encounter from his mind, even suffering from several intense dreams and bouts of insomnia. Eventually, Parada agreed to speak about the encounter, and it came to light that he had kept a piece of medical dressing that he had used to treat the humanoid's wounds, a dressing that had the figure's blood on it. At the time of writing, though no DNA test had been carried out on this material, at least none that is known to the general public. Just who the figure might have been and for what reason they were in the region remains a complete mystery. The description of this tall humanoid entity is almost identical to descriptions of apparent aliens that were reported in abundance in the 1950s and are often referred to as the Nordics. These tall white humanoids of yesteryear were typically friendly and non-aggressive, and often looked to impart knowledge and guidance to the people who encountered them. Furthermore, these encounters were not abductions, but meetings where the respective witness remained of their own free will rather than being held or forced. It is interesting to note that some researchers have questioned if these tall white humanoids could be connected to the legends of angels in biblical writings. If that is true, then we might find that these apparent supernatural beings, aka angels, are in fact flesh and blood entities, albeit from elsewhere. We know, for example, that the figure in Parada's account was bleeding, and so was not some kind of supernatural apparition. Ultimately, the encounter remains a mystery, as does who the humanoid might have been. It is, though, far from the only encounter on record with bizarre and mysterious humanoid figures. A decade previously in England, an altogether different encounter with strange humanoid beings took place. According to the account, which first appeared on the paranormal blog Tales from Out There, and soon spread to multiple other media platforms, on the afternoon of July 12, 2009, somewhere in Wiltshire, an off-duty police sergeant was driving along the country roads when something caught his eye in one of the nearby fields at the roadside. When he turned to look in that direction, he could see several strange-looking men walking around in one of the cornfields. His first thought was that the figures, most likely teenagers enjoying a few beers out of the way. However, for reasons he couldn't explain, he had a strange feeling about them, and so decided to pull his car to the side of the road and investigate further. He got out of the car and began across the field, all the while the strange feeling getting stronger and stronger. As he got closer, he could see there were three separate individuals, each of whom was at least 6 feet tall, most likely taller. They were each dressed in what appeared to be white overalls and moved about as if they were examining the ground, as if they were looking for something. Seeing this, he now dismissed that the figures were teenagers and contemplated that they were a forensics team. Now thinking a significant crime had been committed, he increased his pace, eager to offer assistance. As he got closer still, however, he began to hear a crackling sound like static electricity all around him. He stopped and listened for a moment, realizing that the sound appeared to be moving around him, and with each crackle, one of the crops where the sound came from moved in sympathy. Realizing something strange was unfolding around him, the sergeant called out to the three men. However, none of them acknowledged or responded to him. He continued, and after taking several more steps, the three figures suddenly became aware of his presence. A moment later, all three of the figures turned and ran faster than any man the witness had ever seen. Within a second or two, they had disappeared. The static-like crackling sounds continued, however, and they continued to move around him. For the first time, the strange feeling turned to outright fear, and yet a sudden urge to flee the field and head back to his car. He did just that, and several moments later, he was sitting in his car at the roadside. A moment after that, he started the engine and drove home, by which time he was experiencing an intense headache and intense feelings of nausea. Interestingly, the witness did report the incident to a superior officer later that evening. However, the officer concerned refused to investigate the incident. Furthermore, as it had happened while the witness was off duty, there was no official report on record. He was encouraged to forget about the encounter. However, because of its truly surreal nature, he found himself contemplating it more and more. When he discovered that a crop circle had recently appeared in the field where he had seen the three strange figures, he contacted a local expert and researcher, Andrew Russell. Russell explored the incident and quickly came to the conclusion that the police sergeant had witnessed a group of extraterrestrials, often referred to as tall white aliens. Russell also indicated that he was uncertain if these alien beings were responsible for the crop circle or whether they were looking to inspect it. You might recall that the police officer heard a crackling static electricity sound around him during the encounter. This could be suggestive of the crop circle forming around him while he was there. Just what the anonymous police sergeant witnessed that afternoon in a lonely field in Wiltshire remains unknown. One thing of interest to note is that the witness claimed it appeared as though the three humanoids were searching for something on the ground, perhaps as if they were on some kind of fact-finding mission. As we shall see, this is something that comes up repeatedly in encounters with strange humanoid entities. Several years earlier, at a little after 4 a.m., in the early hours of August 11, 2003, just outside of Szczecin in Poland, another encounter involving humanoid entities unfolded. According to the files of Brian Vike, who obtained the report from Polish UFO investigator Tomek Wierzchowicz, on the morning in question, Lech Chaczynski was making his way to work in his truck along the quiet country road. As he was approaching a bridge, however, a strange figure suddenly appeared in the middle of the road, a short distance ahead of him. Chaczynski focused on the strange figure, realizing that it had its hand held up in front of it as if in greeting. Furthermore, two more almost identical figures stood behind the first one. Kaczynski pulled his truck to the side of the road and brought it to a stop. He could now see that each of the figures wore a shiny suit similar to that of an astronaut. Of more concern, Kaczynski couldn't escape a feeling that there was something disturbingly extraordinary about these three figures, even though they appeared human in almost every way. They were the same height, had 2 arms, 2 legs, etc. He would further describe the attire of the creatures as shiny, but with the appearance of dull silvery elastic foil that had a puffed out look to them. Furthermore, each of the figures wore a helmet with a black visor that covered where the face should have been. Chaczynski also noticed that on the torso there were 7 lights in each row that flashed different colors, while on their back each of the figures carried some kind of backpack, quite possibly some kind of breathing apparatus. Before Chaczynski realized what was happening, one of the figures was outside of his truck cabin, peering in through the side window. From this close-up, he could see through the black visor somewhat and could easily make out 2 round black eyes looking directly at him. He was so unnerved by the pair of eyes that Chaczynski went to restart his truck so he could drive away from the scene as quickly as possible. However, before he could do so, a beam of light emerged from the creature's helmet and struck Chaczynski, and he blacked out. He came to several moments later, only now he felt a sense of calm take over him. Even stranger, he could hear a voice, what he presumed was the creature's voice, inside his head. It was telling him that he should not be afraid before asking Chaczynski if he could hear them. Bizarrely, and without realizing how, Chaczynski replied that he could, but not with his voice, but telepathically. The figure then began asking Chaczynski questions about his vehicle, asking from what material it was made and what fuel it used. He answered these questions as best he could and recalled something akin to a sense of great surprise on the part of the creature as to his answers. Following this, the creature then began speaking to Chaczynski about the catastrophic consequences awaiting the planet if humanity continued on its current course, although he couldn't recall any specific details of the conversation. He did, though, remember asking the humanoid figure one question, asking where they came from. To this, the creatures replied that the 8th galaxy was their home. Although he wasn't sure how long this telepathic exchange lasted, following it, the 3 humanoids ascended into the air and floated away from the road to a large disc-shaped object that hovered nearby. Chaczynski later stated that he wasn't certain if the metallic craft had just arrived or had been waiting close by throughout the encounter. He did recall, however, that it was approximately 150 feet wide and around 1,000 feet from his location. Moreover, he could see what appeared to be several rows of windows running along the side of the upper part of the object, while on the top, in the center, there was an opaque chamber. As he looked down, the 3 figures had positioned themselves directly beneath the craft. Then, without warning, a very bright blue-white light emerged from the underside and took the 3 beings up into the object. Within a moment, the figures and the light were gone, and all that remained beneath the futuristic vehicle was a colored smoke that seemed to wrap itself around the craft. Chaczynski looked on as the object rose into the air to an altitude of around 100 to 150 feet before moving slowly along the ground, the colored smoke following it. It then came to a very brief stop before suddenly shooting into the early morning sky with a bizarre sound that was a cross between a buzzing and a hissing. To his amazement, when he looked to the field where the object had been only moments earlier, He could see clear indentations in the crops that marked a perfect outline of the otherworldly craft. He managed to capture several photographs of the marks in the field, and several others were captured later during subsequent investigations following his report. Ultimately, many UFO investigators explored the case over the years, with almost all coming away feeling that Chisinski was a reliable, credible, and trustworthy witness. Without a doubt, one of the most thought-provoking encounters with humanoid entities unfolded on the evening of January 27, 1978, along the banks of the River Weaver in Cheshire, England. According to an article detailing the account in Volume 26, Number 3, 1980 edition of Flying Saucer Review by Jenny Randles and Paul Wetnall, at around 6 p.m. on the night in question, 4 young men were poaching pheasant near the river in one area referred to locally as the Devil's Garden, a location, coincidentally or not, that has many legends attached to it. Due to their questionable activities, the 4 men would insist on anonymity when speaking of their experience. As they looked for their prize in the woodland and vegetation around the riverbank, one of the men noticed a strange object that appeared to be skimming along the surface of the water. To begin with, largely due to a recent news story of a Soviet satellite crashing to the ground in Canada, the men believed they were seeing another satellite of one of the Cold War superpowers coming back to Earth. However, after observing this aerial anomaly for several moments, it was clear to all of them that the object was not falling but was under some kind of intelligent control, not moving only 20 feet above the ground. It passed directly over the top of the 4 men, a light humming sound appearing to come from it as it did so. As the object passed over them, a strange rushing wind followed behind it, a wind that the witnesses claimed made them feel decidedly unwell. At this distance, the 4 men could see that the object was spherical and had a silver exterior. They watched in shock as the strange craft descended to the ground, landing only a short distance away from where they were standing. They later estimated that the object was around 15 feet across and recalled seeing multiple flashing lights around the side. They also recalled seeing several window-like areas from which a very strange glow could be seen coming from the inside of the craft. Stranger still, the men recalled that they could only look at this light for a short amount of time before their eyes began to hurt. Later conclusions by UFO investigators were that this was some kind of ultraviolet light. Of immediate concern to the 4 men, they quickly noticed that when they looked at the now landed object, it appeared fuzzy to them. This fuzziness alerted them to the potential for increased radiation around the craft, which caused them to begin backing away from it. However, before they could turn their backs, they noticed a strange figure suddenly emerge from the object. They could see that the figure was clearly humanoid and was wearing some kind of silver one-piece suit and a round helmet on its head, on top of which was violet light. The witnesses remained where they were as still as possible and watched as the humanoid appeared to be surveying its surroundings, the light on its helmet illuminating the area it was looking at. Eventually, this violet shade stopped on a herd of cows in a nearby field. After several moments, the humanoid figure turned and returned inside the craft. The 4 men remained still, and a moment later the figure emerged once more. However, this time it was followed by a second humanoid figure, dressed in the same silver-colored suit and wearing the same round helmet with a violet light on top. Between them they were carrying what appeared to be a large silver metal cage. Although the ease with which the 2 figures carried it suggested that it was extremely light. They were heading in the direction of the field where the cows were grazing. Once there, the 2 figures approached one of the cows that was slightly away from the rest of the herd. It was clear to the witnesses that this particular cow appeared to be unnaturally frozen to the spot, as if it had been paralyzed standing up. They looked on as the 2 figures proceeded to place the cage around the cow before beginning to move several metallic plates into place. The witnesses were unsure if the humanoids were merely measuring or weighing the cow, or if they were planning to take it back to their craft. At this point, though, each of them decided that they had seen enough and turned and ran away from the scene, eventually reaching a bridge where they crossed to the other side of the river. From there, they turned around in the direction they had just come from, but were unable to see the humanoids or the spherical craft. Strangely, however, one of the witnesses later told investigators that they recalled some kind of pulling sensation as he was running from the scene, almost as if there was an invisible force intentionally dragging him back. Even stranger, he also claimed that he felt this pull on his testicles, which he stated remained sore for several days afterward. The incident remains unexplained today, almost half a century later. Was this some kind of cattle mutilation case? There are no reports of dead cattle being found in the days following the sighting. If not that, then was this some kind of intelligence gathering mission? Was a cow taken and then returned to the field later? Or was whatever activity there was undertaking carried out right there in the field? All such questions remain unanswered. There were, though, several other similar sightings in the United Kingdom around the same time. On the evening of January 2nd, for example, just 4 weeks before the River Weaver encounter, a resident of Rainford in the Merseyside region of northwestern England reported seeing a humanoid figure wearing a silver suit. Just over 2 weeks later, on January 18th, in the same region, several school children claimed to have seen a small UFO land on the roof of their school. Even more amazing, after several moments, 3 astronauts exited the craft and walked around on top of the school building. The children offered that the 3 humanoids were wearing golden-colored shiny suits. We might question whether these suits were in fact silver that might have been reflecting the sun. Whether there is a connection to the River Weaver encounter remains uncertain. However, we should ask how likely it would be that 3 different sets of witnesses should report seeing almost identical humanoid figures wearing identical clothing in the same, relatively speaking, geographical location within a month of each other. When we add to that the United Kingdom experienced a discrete wave of UFO sightings and even several claims of alien abduction during this time, the River Weaver sighting takes on even more interest to UFO researchers and investigators. Just short of a year later, in the early hours of November 25, 1978, in the La Pizana estate of Spain, near the town of Gerena, another bizarre humanoid encounter unfolded, one that shared many of the details with the River Weaver sighting. Interestingly or not, the following encounter also took place near water, this time near the Guarimar River. On the night in question, at around 3:30 a.m., Manuel Gordillo and 4 friends were near the river in the eucalyptus trees on a late-night hunting trip. After they had been out for several hours, one of the group decided to return to the car and call it a night. The rest of the group decided to stay out. It would be a night none of them would ever forget. Using their powerful flashlights, the remaining hunters scanned the area looking for potential prey. As they were doing so, they noticed what looked to be strange red lights at a short distance away. They appeared similar to the rear brake lights of a car, although none could understand how a car could have been driven into the woodland. The closer they got, the more they realized the red glow was not coming from a car's rear brake lights. Realizing they were dealing with something out of the ordinary, the 4 men turned out their flashlights and began to approach much more cautiously. They watched the strange glow for several moments before deciding to cross to the other side of the river and resume their hunt. During this, though, Gordillo somehow became separated from the rest of the group. To begin with, realizing he was alone, he moved the beam of his flashlight around him in an attempt to locate his friends. He couldn't, though, see them anywhere. He then turned the flashlight off and whistled loudly, attempting to alert them. This worked, and almost immediately he could see their flashlights heading in his direction. By the time they had found him, Gordillo could see that something strange had happened to them. Before he could contemplate things any further, one of his friends turned to him and asked, "Didn't you see that again?" To this, Gordillo answered that he hadn't seen anything unusual since they viewed the red lights on the other side of the river. His friends informed him that they had seen the bizarre lights again when he had become separated from them. After taking several moments to discuss what they should do, Gordillo, along with one of the hunters, Francisco Lopez Rivero, chose to head in the direction of the lights and investigate further while the rest of the group covered them from a distance. They had only taken several steps when the lights were in view once more. From this distance, the lights appeared to be shaking. The closer they got to them, however, the more details became clear to them. They could see that there wasn't just one light, but several of them, all in a row, and that they were on the side of a large object. Gordillo recalled that the object was hovering close to the ground and was a distinct round shape. From this distance, approximately 100 feet, he could see that the lights were not red, but different colors. Rivero would offer a different description, stating that the object was similar to a large earthen jar, upside down, and with a red light on top. He also recalled that the lights were different colors, stating they were a mixture of green, orange, yellow, and red, as well as that the object appeared to rest on several silver legs. Even stranger, though not, what really got their attention was the strange humanoid person who was walking in front of them. As it moved, Gordillo temporarily lost sight of it, unable to tell the figure had returned inside the craft or had walked around it. Then the figure was back in view once more. At this point, Gordillo could only see the bottom half of the figure, but it appeared it was very tall, and he could see it was wearing some kind of boots. The two men could also hear a bizarre humming sound that appeared to come from the humanoid, almost as if it was humming. Rivero, who was several feet behind Gordillo, recalled briefly seeing that the figure was wearing a shiny silver helmet with a visor similar to a typical motorbike helmet. Furthermore, much like Gordillo, Rivero also sensed the figure was tall, standing between 6.5 and 7 feet. You know that saying about curiosity killed a cat? I would have thought about that, but anyway, that's just me. The next thing they realized, the figure was heading in their direction. By the time it was close enough for them to hear the sound of its footsteps, the two men turned around and ran back to the rest of the group. Once there, all four of them scrambled back to the other side of the river and back to their car. While that was the end of the initial encounter, several weeks later on January 14, 1979, Rivero returned to the location with UFO investigators. It took several hours, but they eventually found the location where they had witnessed the strange figure and equally strange object. They could see that there was a clear circular indentation in the vegetation that had created a clearing of sorts. All agreed that the clearing appeared far from natural and seemed to have been made by the object that had landed there. Perhaps of more interest to investigators, they also discovered what appeared to be several strange footprints. What was particularly interesting about these footprints, although investigators were unable to determine exactly when the footprints had been made, they were able to determine that whoever or whatever had made them had likely stood around 7 feet tall, exactly as Gordillo and Rivero had estimated. Ultimately, while the Pisana encounter remains unexplained, it contains several intriguing and resonating details, ones that also show up in many other humanoid cases. In fact, around the same time, Spain experienced several very similar humanoid encounters. One of these occurred in Sevilla, also in November 1978. According to the files of Moisés Garrido Vázquez, Antonia Aranda awoke suddenly in the middle of the night to find a 7-foot-tall humanoid standing over her bed. The figure was dressed entirely in black, with a black helmet and a visor covering its face. Excuse me. Before she could take in any more details, she felt a blast of cold, icy air hit her in the face before she blacked out. When she came to, she saw a round, glowing metal sphere hovering directly over the top of her, and she knew instinctively that the cold blast of air had come from this curious hovering device. The next thing she knew, the figure dressed in black approached her once more. He claimed to her that he was regenerating her. She then blacked out once more. When she awoke next time, the figure and strange spherical device were nowhere to be seen. In the years that followed, Antonia claimed to have had several further encounters with this strange figure. Also interesting, following these encounters, she noticed how she had strange effects on electrical devices, even causing many of them to cease working altogether. It is also worth mentioning that at the same time in East Sussex in the United Kingdom, which was experienced its own wave of UFO and humanoid encounters, a local resident claimed to have seen a bizarre humanoid figure who was dressed entirely in black, including a black helmet that covered its face from her window. At the same time, she noticed that her pet dog was seemingly petrified and cowered in the corner of the room. Another encounter that unfolded in November 1978, this time somewhere in Italy, is of further interest. On the night in question, somewhere around midnight, Antonio F. was watching television at his home when his pet dog suddenly began barking close to the window. Antonio got up from his chair and walked over to the window and looked outside, contemplating that there might be an intruder in the yard. At first, he could see nothing unusual. Then, out of the cold, drizzly night, a bright orange glow appeared approximately 100 feet from his property. In a similar response as the hunters in La Pisana, Antonio contemplated whether the glow belonged to a passing car that was experiencing trouble or had even crashed. However, a moment later he dismissed this possibility. deciding that he was instead looking at something altogether more unusual. Despite the late hour, he called out to his family. However, by the time they had dragged themselves from their beds, the lights had disappeared. They all returned inside, certain the strangeness had ended. However, a short time later, the dog began barking once more, alerting Antonio that whatever he had seen had returned. A moment later, he ventured outside once more to investigate. He began in the direction where he had seen the lights a short time earlier. Before he could reach the location, though, he heard a sudden rustling sound from the nearby vegetation. Instinctively, he turned on the flashlight he was carrying and pointed the beam in the direction the sound had come from. He was more than shocked when the light settled on two humanoid figures. Each figure wore a dark, tight-fitting, one-piece suit, and each was at least 6 feet tall. The two figures appeared to stare at Antonio for several moments before retreating into the shadows. When Antonio went to the location, he had seen the figures the following day. He discovered a round patch of burnt vegetation on the ground. He contemplated the glowing object had made this burnt patch and whether that had been the craft the two humanoids had arrived in. Once more, we might ask if these two humanoids are the same as those witnessed by the hunters in La Pisana. According to an article in the April 6, 1976 edition of Flying Saucer Review, titled Forest Feeding by J. M. Bingorn, on a lonely road in France at around 5:30 a.m. on February 28, 1974, an anonymous 59-year-old man was riding his moped along Highway 38 when he suddenly found himself at the center of a bizarre encounter with mysterious humanoids. As he was coming over a bridge that stretched over the River Ton, he suddenly experienced a bizarre episode of missing time. He realized that he was no longer moving and was simply sitting on his moped on the roadside. He couldn't recall slowing down his moped or coming to a stop. It was as if he was moving one moment and then stopped dead the next. He was so confused that it took him a moment to notice the two humanoid figures, who he referred to as cosmonauts, due to the round helmets on their heads, who were standing right next to him. He could have sworn he was alone only moments earlier. It was as if these figures were not there one moment and next to him the next, as if they had just appeared out of thin air. As well as the helmet with a visor that covered their face, they each wore a dark one-piece tight-fitting suit. He also noticed that each of the figures wore a pair of long, five-fingered gloves that went right the way up their arms, which the witness likened to gloves used for the artificial insemination of cattle. It was at this point that he became aware of a huge circular object that he described as a dark circular mass with no lights that was sitting on the ground in a nearby field. He estimated the object was around the size of two cars and appeared to be completely silent. As he was taking in the details of the craft, his foot still resting on the ground as he sat on his moped, the two humanoids began to investigate the handlebars. They occasionally looked at him, which caused a surge of fear to run through him. Then things turned even more surreal. The two humanoids began gesturing to the witness in a manner that they were encouraging him to eat something. When the witness simply remained still and looked at them, the two figures turned to each other and appeared to be somehow communicating. Then one of them reached behind him and produced a small square that the witness claimed looked a piece like chocolate. Once more the figure gestured to the witness that he should eat it. More out of fear than anything else, the witness took the square and ate it. He later stated that although it was tasteless, it had a similar texture to chocolate, although slightly softer. As he ate it, the two humanoids simply watched him as if they were ensuring he swallowed it. When he had done so, they backed away slightly and gestured at him once more, motioning that he was now free to go. He started his moped immediately and left the scene as fast as he could. He later told UFO investigators that he had no actual memory of setting off. One moment he was watching the figures, gesturing that he could go. The next he was speeding down the road as he had been before he came over the bridge. Of course, whether this was due to the surrealness of the situation or whether these strange beings used some kind of technology to cloud his memory remains open to debate. Investigators, though, would soon manage to piece together a fuller picture of the anonymous witness encounter. Although he didn't notice any effects after eating the chocolate-like substance because the witness didn't see a doctor in the hours following the incident, no medical test could be carried out in an attempt to see what the substance was. Furthermore, it remained a mystery as to why the humanoids were insistent that he ate it in the first place. It is perhaps worth mentioning many alien abduction encounters where the abductee is asked, or sometimes forced, to drink a clear, tasteless liquid so that their memory of their respective encounter is erased. Although this was food and not a drink, could it be that the effect of the chocolate like substance achieved the same end? Could the humanoids have been so insistent that he eat the square substance in the hope that he would not recall the bizarre incidents? Perhaps much more happened that strange night that is locked away in the witness's memory. As time went on, the witness became less and less inclined to speak about the bizarre encounter, not least due to the ridicule received from work colleagues and some of his friends. However, some of the witness's neighbors took it upon themselves to visit the location where he claimed the event had unfolded, and when they did, they made some remarkable discoveries. In the precise location where the witness claimed he had seen the craft in the field, they found several depressions in the ground, as if something very heavy had recently rested there. Furthermore, the surrounding vegetation had been squashed in a perfect circle, the same shape the witness claimed the aircraft was. UFO investigators later spoke with the neighbors in question and found them all to be of sound mind and ultimately credible witnesses. Just who the strange humanoids were and why they seemingly stopped a witness and forced him to eat the chocolate like substance remains a complete mystery. Perhaps further adding credibility to the admittedly bizarre encounter is that there are several other very similar reports from France near the same time as the Highway 38 incident. Only 2 weeks previously, for example, according to an article in the number 14 second quarter 1975 edition of Oranos, around 1:30 p.m. on February 14, 1974, in Petite Île, another anonymous gentleman was walking along a quiet country road when he suddenly felt a strange force pulling at him, as well as a tingling sensation that permeated his entire body. At this point, the witness looked around to see if they could identify the source of the strange force. His focus quickly fell upon a white disc-shaped object that had a domed upper section. He watched in amazement as it hovered a short distance from the ground, only several feet from him. Then, without warning, an urgent beam of light came from the craft and settled straight on him. Through the light, he could see three small beings that he estimated were no more than 3 feet in height. These strange figures were moving back and forth, seeming to go back inside the craft through some kind of doorway in the side and then back out again. He later described these creatures as wearing a metallic one-piece suit, each identical to the other. He remained where he was and watched the bizarre scene play out in front of him. Then, after several minutes, the three figures re-entered the craft, which began to ascend rapidly until it disappeared. For several days after the encounter, the witness experienced severe headaches, as well as temporary vision impairment, likely from the beam of light. According to an article in Volume 22, 1976 edition of Flying Saucer Review, at around 9 p.m. on August 26, 1974, in Fanes, a little over 6 months after the Highway 38 incident, a resident was waiting anxiously outside their home for the return of his daughter, who was late returning from a festival in the town. As he was pacing outside, he noticed a curious object in the night sky, one that he later described as being a perfectly round black hole that was around 700 feet from where he stood. He watched it for several moments, certain that the object was descending in a controlled and purposeful manner. At this point, the man ran inside the house to inform his wife of the aerial anomaly. They both rushed back outside, the craft still overhead, but now much closer, less than 100 feet from the ground. From this proximity, the pair could see a corona of light around the object split from the middle, giving the impression of two-letter Ds as they moved. Eventually, they split completely apart from each other, with one of them heading into the distance while the other remained hovering overhead. The pair continued to watch the object and were more than shocked to see two humanoid figures dressed almost identical to an astronaut moving around on the other side of what appeared to be a large window in the side of the object. The astronaut-type suits appeared to be made from some kind of metallic-type material and were gray-white in color. Strangely, the figures moved in a bizarre manner, almost like puppets that were two-dimensional. In total, the husband and wife watched the object and humanoids inside it for around 40 minutes, before his concern for his daughter became too great, and the main witness drove into the town to look for her. By the time he returned, his daughter now with him, the bizarre object had disappeared. Like many other encounters we have explored, the sightings remain unexplained. We might note that several of the encounters we have examined here have featured humanoids wearing some kind of one-piece suit, often silver, at least partially in color. More often than not, these suits are made of some kind of metallic material. Furthermore, although not exclusively, many of these humanoids wear helmets with a dark or black colored visor obscuring their facial features. Is it a mere coincidence that they were in such similar attire, or does it suggest that we could be dealing with one specific race of alien or otherworldly visitor? Might we even consider that these humanoids, dressed almost identically to modern astronauts, could be human time travelers from the future or even another dimension? As we mentioned at the start, there are about a handful of questions from a handful of encounters with the bizarre humanoid beings, and we will undoubtedly return to this area of interest in a future article to explore more of these fascinating and mind-blowing accounts. For now, we have much to contemplate, not least how the accounts we have examined there might fit into the larger picture of the UFO mystery and the wider paranormal world. You know, it's really funny because when the at the beginning with the when the alien says, "I've got something shocking to see," that's not a good way to start a conversation, either with humans or with aliens, but especially with an extraterrestrial. I've got something that's going to shock you. It'd be like, no, no, no. I don't want to be shocked. Thanks. Anyway, let's go back to Stranger Than Fiction stories, and this is titled The Lady in the Lake of Durand Eastman Park. The White Lady is said to be seen only on foggy evenings in Durand Eastman Park in Rochester, New York, and her sightings date back to the early 1800s. It is said to be the specter of a woman looking for her daughter who was murdered nearby. In the early 1900s, Dr. Henry S. Durand and his friend George Eastman, of Eastman Kodak fame by the way, bought property in the area. In 1907, they mysteriously donated a 502-acre tract with nearly 6 miles of lakeshore to the city of Rochester to be used as a public park. Some speculated if they knew something about its ghostly lady, which was said to predate their occupancy of the property. Extensive construction went into making the swampy, almost treeless farmland into what is now a beautiful park. Prior to this, Dr. Durand would vacation on a summer camp situated there. Two smaller lakes that are situated next to Lake Ontario were named in their honor. Deer, buffaloes, and elk were eventually introduced into the park. There were toboggan rides and concerts were held in the spring and summer. The story goes that a woman possibly named Elisa lived on the land which is now the park. There are different versions as to why she haunts the land. In one story, she murdered her husband and his mistress, and in another, her teenage daughter disappeared. The woman was convinced she had been murdered by a neighboring farmer. Without her daughter's body, she was unable to prove that she had been abducted and murdered. She would search the grounds with her German Shepherd dogs, until one day in despondency, she leapt to her death off a cliff into Lake Ontario. There are other versions of how she lost her daughter. In one, the teenager elopes with her lover, who instead murders her. In another, she's abducted and killed by a group of marauders as she walks by the lake. In a third version, her husband was a merchant, as in the Lady in White, was a merchant shipper who died while serving on a boat on the Great Lakes. Unable to find peace in life or death, she haunts the grounds as the White Lady. She is sometimes seen with her dogs, and other times alone. At times she is described as the thin, ugly woman, other times as a young woman who materializes out of the mist that coalesce on the surface of Lake Durand. She is said to have a predilection for chasing men into the lake or out of the park altogether. Some say there is a connection between the ghost and the ruins of a hotel still found there called the White Lady's Castle. This dates back to 1911 when a refectory was built to offer refreshments to tourists visiting the park. If Elisa ever did live here, any remnants or foundations for her home have disappeared or are buried beyond finding. Like many local legends of white ladies, many believe there is no historical truth to the ghost. However, there are those who claim to have seen the specter. Amid the stories of the White Lady, camping facilities were added in 1925 to the park, and in 1931, the golf course was extended to 18 holes. In 1948, the beaches were closed and the Grand Bathhouse was demolished in 1974 after being unused for many years. Swimming was allowed until 1966 when pollution forced the closure of the beach again until 2006. In March of 2017, fierce winds blew through the park, splintering a tree trunk with what many say is the form of a ghostly lady. Yes, and for those of you watching the video version of this, this is what that tree looks like. That, yeah, it does look weird, but this is like just like those people that see the face of Jesus or the Virgin Mary and toast and sell it on eBay. But anyway, let's keep going. In 1988, the horror film Lady in White, starring Lucas Haas and based on this story, was filmed in the area. By the way, I love that movie. There were no sinister occurrences in the park to explain the origins of the White Lady. In 1914, two men died, one by drowning in the lake and another when his vehicle skidded and overturned at the entrance to the park. In 1974, park officials denied the existence of the White Lady, saying it was only an urban myth. Their problem was that a rare pine tree was painted with the ghost-like image of the lady. The foreman, John Delanola, who had been with the Park Service for 26 years, remembers a story told to him about a man driving on his way home along Lakeshore Boulevard. It supposedly happened around 1944 near the bathhouse between Three Lakes Camp and the old police athletic league cabin. It was after 11 p.m. when the man slowed down to take the curve by the bathhouse when he saw a woman floating through the shadowy pines. She was dressed in what appeared to be a wedding dress with a veil and a long train. Walter Sassman, a town historian, found references to the White Lady as far back as World War I. World War I, of course, coinciding with right after the park was given over, in other words, created. It started in 1907, so, and apparently the problem that they had, well, until recently was, and by the way, they have had lately, like in the last couple of years, one lady was partially dismembered. They found her remains in the lake. And there was another older gentleman that was basically stabbed to death several times by a woman and by a dumpster. I don't know if it's that the area has like declined. But normally, and I'm sure things happen, but like the drowning and the accident, that's bound to happen. But there was no sinister, in other words, no factual historical reference to who this lady was. But that doesn't mean she doesn't exist. Or maybe she's just one of the many stories that we hear out there about white ladies, just like the ones that the hitchhiker ghost kind of thing. That you find some version of it all over the world, as a matter of fact. You ask, the lady asks for a ride, she disappears. Or, the address that you go to, all of a sudden she's not there. And then you find out that this lady or this girl has died many years ago. Or recently, even the one at the lake in White Lake in Texas, she even leaves a like a watery like water on the seat where she was at. Supposedly she was a drowning victim. So, yeah, I have a feeling that that's the legend of that white lady in the park. But then again, you never know, and that's why it's part of Eerie News. I will be back with you soon, very soon. Till next time.